Alright, hello everybody. Welcome to our next lesson here. Today we're going to talk about the Civil War and African Americans. So our objectives and standards to explain the causes and results of the Civil War and to analyze the roles of African Americans in the Civil War. And take a moment there to read the standards as well. And our desired result, what role did African Americans play in the Civil War? So the beginning of war, President Lincoln took office on March 4th, 1861, and he hopes that he can restore peace in the country. Now remember, a lot of southern states were not happy that Lincoln became president. They see Lincoln as a threat to their way of life and, of course, to slavery. But Lincoln comes into the office and to becoming president hoping that maybe, just maybe, things can be resolved. Unfortunately, the war will start 2 months later after that. Now, following the attack on Fort Sumter in South Carolina, which you see here, Lincoln sent troops to stop the rebellion. So Southern troops fired on Fort Sumter, which was a federal arsenal, again, keeping weapons and everything like that there. And so after the Southern states fired on this federal building, basically, this federal fort, that's when Lincoln decides to send troops to stop the rebellion. Now, many Northerners are going to answer the call for troops to stop the Confederacy, to stop this kind of oncoming Civil War. And as a result of Lincoln sending troops down to the South, other Southern states will then join the Confederacy. We have Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina will now join the Confederacy as well in fighting against the North. So war preparation. Both sides, the Union, which is the North, and the Confederacy, which is the South, prepared for war. Now, when African Americans first volunteered to fight for the North, the Union actually turned them away. However, some African Americans will form informal troops and train for fighting. Now, there were some Union generals who disagreed with the decision not to use African Americans, and many escaped Confederate slaves, known as contrabands, began to show up at Union camps looking for protection. They are going to work as cooks, and they're going to help with hospitals, and also in the Confederacy, slaves also worked for soldiers as cooks and wagon drivers as well. So fighting for freedom. Eventually, African Americans were able to join the Union Army, and they're going to help the war effort in many different ways. As the war continues on, many people felt that the war would only go on for maybe a year or a couple of months. The North felt maybe they could squash the South thought they could beat the North. But unfortunately, when the fighting starts out in 1861, many people don't realize that the war is going to go on for another 4 years, another 4 bloody years to be, in fact. So, as the war continues on and many people are dying, and the results are just terrifying, all these, young boys and men being killed and the destruction of property and homes, many people begin to change their attitudes about African American troops. They believe that African American troops can now make a difference in the war. So in July of 1862, Congress is going to approve the limited enlistment of African Americans. Now, there were some African-American units in the Union-controlled South as well. The Corps d'Afrique was the first Louisiana Native Guards in 1862. And African-American leaders will push for more recruitment of troops as well. This monument here is to the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, which was one of the first African-American regiments. Unfortunately, as you saw in the beginning clip there about the information about what happened to the 54th Massachusetts, Colonel Robert Shaw and many of his men will be killed at the attack or the assault on Fort Wagner. And this memorial here is a memorial to them. So here's Colonel Robert Shaw here on his horse with his African-American troops. Again, a big bravery attempt and a big heroic attack by this unit in the South, and they're known for that today. If you ever want to look up a movie, it's called Glory, and it has Matthew Broderick, Denzel Washington, Morgan Freeman, The movie was made in the late 80s, 1989, I believe, but it's a perfect historical depiction of the 54th Massachusetts. A very great movie. So I'm not sure what the rating is, so check that out before you watch. I'm not sure if it's rated R or PG-13 or anything like that, but it is a good movie. If you like to look it up, I highly recommend it. I've seen it myself multiple times, and it's a well done movie, and like I said, it does explain what happened to the 54th Massachusetts Infantry in great detail and historical accuracy as well. Now, also, however, not just in the North, but in March of 1865, the Confederacy tried to recruit African Americans, but in April of 1865, facing limited resources and a lack of men and things like that, and the Confederacy will surrender in April of 1865, bringing an end to the Civil War. So, African American troops. Low pay and limited amounts of supply faced African American troops. Now, some took action, like the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, which we just talked about here. They protested low wages and refused pay for a year that eventually the U.S. government agreed to pay better wages. Another hardship for African American troops was if they were captured, they faced execution or enslavement by Confederate troops, while whites were mainly prisoners of war. So African Americans weren't even typically treated as prisoners of war. They were either executed or put back into enslavement. Even if they weren't slaves before, they were put into slavery. 186,000 African Americans served in Union forces, and there were also African American sailors in the U.S. Navy as well. An example was Robert Smalls, who showed bravery and loyalty. You see his picture there. And 23 Medals of Honor were awarded to African American troops, and many of them served in more than 250 engagements African Americans did. Contributing to the cause. Now, African American women also played a role in the Civil War. They served as nurses, cooks, or sewed and washed. Susie King Taylor was a nurse and also taught soldiers to read and write. And a leading African-American abolitionist was Sojourner Truth. She supported the war effort and helped raise money for African-American refugees. Truth also met with President Lincoln, who convinced her to nurse African-American soldiers at Freedmen's Hospital. And the secrets of spies. There were also African-Americans who worked as spies for the Union Army. Officials in the Union found that African-Americans were good at transmitting Confederate information. They were also better at not being detected, like white spies had been. African-American women, such as Harriet Tubman, would gather information from slaves, and another famous person was Mary Elizabeth Bowser, who she worked in the home of Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy, and she listened to conversations and examined documents, and then she passed that information on to Union officials. A comma there, sorry about that. All right. And our closure, what role did African Americans play in the Civil War? Think about what role they played, how did they impact the war, what were some of the things they were doing as soldiers or helping otherwise, and that will help you answer your question. Hope you have a great rest of your day or night, and I will talk to you guys soon.